Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Just a few more minutes. We are still having people in the waiting room joining us. Okay, so I think one more minute because we're still letting people in. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I guess we can start. Is that okay, Andy?
Yeah.
So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Monday afternoon. We appreciate you all because we know it's summer and people are going on vacation. So thank you for being here. Today is going to be interesting because we're going to go over a bunch of proposals that Andy's going to, go over and the reason why. But in terms of housekeeping, please raise your hand if you have any questions. I don't think we have anyone from a phone number because I know that's sort of difficult to raise your hand sometimes. But if we do get a phone number at some point, I will make sure that we provide opportunity for that person to ask questions. But yeah, and I think that's it. So welcome, everybody. Andy, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Welcome, guys. We'll jump in here real quick, but just wanted to share briefly. We're going to try something a little bit new today. So just for expediency's sake, kind of efficiency, we're recognizing that we only have so many more of these meetings scheduled throughout September, October. So, and we still have a lot of proposals to get through. So what we're trying to do is kind of group some together that have very similar ideas. So today we're actually going to have 4 presenters, but they're going to be covering about 9 proposals. So again, our goal is to kind of try to move through some of these that are very similar in idea and kind of do them together. So there was one other thing. Oh yeah, the other thing we're going to do today a little bit differently is rather than going presentation, conversation, presentation, conversation, we are going to move through all these proposals in order, and then we are going to have a lot of time spent on clarifying questions. So Matt, you would go first, and then from there, Anjali, what did we have? Wow. And then I think we go Ken Dolsky, Leslie Sauer, and Sarah Webb. I think that's our order. I'm pretty sure. So sound good? Anjali, anything to add?
Yeah, no, nothing to add. I think you're correct. Just to re-emphasize, we're doing this because they're all similar in topic, and it just makes a lot of sense to listen to everybody and then open it up for discussion so that we're more efficient with time. So yeah, so like you said, Andy, Matt, you are first. We have a question from Ken. Let's just give me 1 second. Ken,
all right, so I just wanted to make clear. So we're going to go through this and we're not going to ask any questions until the very end.
Right. Yes.
Okay, very
All
good.
of the proposals are similar in topic, so we figure, you know, it makes a lot of sense to unite
Okay.
everyone.
Very
Yeah,
good.
if you can.
Yep.
One question from Doug. Okay, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, I believe Matt was the first one on the list, the same
Yes.
list. I couldn't see it. It said it was in his trash. You couldn't see it. It was being updated. I never saw the proposal. Did anybody else have that problem?
If you go into the shared folder, he had a revision. And I guess it didn't update in the email, but it is the new.
Okay, because
in
when
the
I
shared-
tried it,
Can you access it? I know we don't have the chat feature here, but if you go into the list of participants and just go right into the shared folder for proposals, if anyone is having trouble, I'm going to ask them to contact Allison Schmeider via email. Or just, you know what, send it through to the New Jersey Forest Task Force Gmail account if you're having trouble. Allie is going to be manning that, and she will send you the direct link. So please, anyone who did not get access to any of the proposals, please email the Gmail account. Thank you, Doug.
okay, thank you. That's fine. I'll defer to the wisdom of the group, but okay.
Well, Doug, and also Matt is gonna explain his proposal. Yeah. So everybody should have about 3 minutes to explain your proposal and your main ideas. And that's what we mean by everybody presenting their proposals and then open it up for discussion. I'm Margaret, we're going to take your questions and then we're going to move into the proposal. So go ahead, Margaret, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, I saw the same thing with the proposal being deleted, and then I found it listed with the references. So it is there if you look in the group of references, it's the last one. Then I wanted to make a comment about voting. Last time when you voted, you asked how many people oppose and raise your hand if you want to make a comment. And then you just assumed that everyone else was in agreement, whereas I would assume that the majority are abstaining because they're not well educated on the subject. So I hope in the future, when you vote how many are for and how many are against, and you acknowledge the fact that most people abstain. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Just to clarify, we're trying to reach consensus. So we really haven't gone to like an official voting per se. So, but that's a good flag that if people are not raising their hands. But I think when we bring the question of like, do you disagree with this? We're asking who does disagree, so that anybody that may object can raise their hands. So, that's
Okay.
really what we're looking. If there's a big majority of people that don't object to that, then we take that as a consensus. But Tom, I see that you want to say something.
Well, I would just say that, yeah, I mean, based on some of the guidance that we looked at in terms of how to deal with consensus and determine consensus, it pretty much was defined in that way, in that, you know, getting to an item where if people don't disagree with it, right, it's sort of, and there's varying levels of agreement, from I fully support this to, you know, I don't love it, but I can live with it, to everything in between. But for the purposes of consensus, we just need to know if anybody objects to it. And if people don't object to it, then it is considered consensus.
Mhm.
And we don't,
Yeah.
you know, we're not necessarily taking the temperature to get a sense of where people fall on that spectrum of whether they love it or whether they can live with it.
But there were people who disagreed.
Well, they had the opportunity to say that. We want to know if you disagree. Let
They
us
did
know.
say that. They did say that. I was
Yeah.
one of them.
And that
Yeah.
was, and everyone that disagreed was noted.
Mhm.
So that if we determine something to be consensus doesn't mean unanimity. It means the vast, you know, overwhelming majority of the group, and there can be, you know, a small number of dissenters, and it can still be considered consensus. And in that case, we note that there were some dissenters. We characterize, you know, who the dissenters were and the nature of their objections. But basically what I'm saying is that we were following a consensus process there. It wasn't, as Anjali said, it wasn't voting. And the key there to determine consensus is who disagrees, who cannot live with this. That's the key question.
I think it's worth saying the order of presenters. So we're gonna start with Matt, then Ken, then Leslie, and then you go at the end, Sarah. Webb, but I see that you have a question. We have to get to proposals, but let me just give you the opportunity to ask your question, Sarah, but then we'll just really go to proposals. Sarah, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I recognize we have a very little time, but I have to say we're now getting to the most important issues of this task force, and to give each presenter what 3 minutes, am I getting 90 seconds for each of my two proposals? And it just seems, I believe, a little bit short shrift given the very importance of these issues. So I
It's
just
3
share
minutes
that
per
very
proposal,
very
Sarah.
difficult to present, you know, such complex and important information in such a short amount of time after we spent so much time on other things. I realize you're doing your best to get it all done, but that seems very abbreviated.
It's not 3 minutes just for you, it's 3 minutes per proposal. And of course, if you go a little bit over, we're not gonna cut you off. We're just giving this as a guidance so that we can be time efficient, so we can get through everybody. But if you could just do the best that you can to present your ideas within that time frame, we're very appreciative. But it's not just 3 minutes for you. We recognize that you have more than one proposal, so
And as a quick reminder for everyone, our hope, our goal is that by putting the resources out there early, the proposal out there early, you all are taking time to prepare yourself for this meeting so that Sarah is not starting from scratch. So you should be familiar with her proposal already. Everybody's proposal you should be familiar with. So that's why we don't feel the need to have a 10-minute presentation. Most of you should have already looked at the sources, looked at the materials, and be prepared for the conversation. So we don't have time for everybody to make a full presentation. So that's our idea. Hopefully people are spending time researching on their own and reading beforehand. So, okay, Anjali, I said there we go here.
yeah, here we go. So Matt, you are next. Need for an actionable and comprehensive forest management plan for New Jersey public lands. Matt, are you here? Can you raise your hand because I don't see you? Oh, there you are. You can unmute yourself. Go
Okay,
ahead.
you can hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So I was asked actually to reintroduce a proposal that I presented at the end of the last meeting. So some of this is going to sound really familiar. I did go ahead and revise, and so there's some discussion about accessing the revised version. And to be honest, the revision was really just some clarification for the most part. I tried to provide some examples of what I was meaning by things. So it just hopefully comes across as being a little more clear. So some of what I'm going to talk about right now is very similar to what I talked about the last time I presented, but just with some additional clarifications. So I figure maybe kind of a good place to start would be kind of a vision that I have personally for NJDEP managed forests. And so my vision, the way I see it, is like, as a New Jersey resident, what I'd like to see is the state maintain healthy, diverse, productive forests capable of sustaining vital ecosystem services to New Jersey residents. Right? That's obviously the 30,000 foot, very kind of broad view of things. What I mean by ecosystem services, vital ecosystem services, kind of what I have in mind in this case would be carbon storage and climate regulation, habitat for native biodiversity, and not just mature forest species, but forest species that associate with other successional habitat types. Disturbance regulation, water purification, oxygen release and provision, and then places to recreate, right? So that's kind of what I have in mind when I think of vital ecosystem services. So what I'm proposing is that to kind of achieve this and be able to sustain these services is a combination of active and passive management being practiced on all state lands, state administered lands. And so what I kind of see in this case is that by integrating both the active and passive management, what we can do is that we can yield benefits ranging from protection of older forests for carbon storage and also providing mature forest habitat for species that associate with those types of conditions. while also giving flexibility to be able to practice silviculture to sustain diverse habitats for native biodiversity associated also with early and mid-successional stages. Protecting old forest is going to give us the old forest habitat. We still have to ensure that we're supplying younger habitats on the landscape as well. And I kind of think of more of a successional mosaic being maintained over time. Active management can also be used to reduce risks to forest health associated with disease-causing agents and disturbances. And so kind of what I kind of talk about as far as, ways about doing this would be zoning our state forest land into two broad categories of protection areas where passive management would operate, and then conservation areas where we would practice science-based conservation approaches, active management approaches. The conservation zones themselves, again, kind of a focus on biodiversity conservation, so maintaining a mosaic of successional habitats over time, while also being able to practice what I consider to be harm reduction measures, so silviculture for reducing risks from various forest stress factors, biotic, abiotic factors, as well as trying to regulate impacts of catastrophic disturbances. In a lot of ways, what I envision here is very similar to a proposal you're going to hear tomorrow that Vin Lang and Jean Montgomery put forth. And in this case, they talked about also zoning state land, but in their proposal, they actually included a third category of habitat management. In a sense, I kind of had that in mind when I created mine as well, but it also, if anything, it made me realize that in my original proposal that that there was something lacking there, kind of weakness in mind. So I'm happy, after reading theirs, that they kind of addressed that a bit. So I really think that we need to make, if these truly are conservation lands, we have to make biodiversity conservation a real focus of what we do as well. It's not just about mature forest conditions, but I think also we have to sustain earlier and mid-successional conditions as well. So I also call for a comprehensive approach. And what I mean by comprehensive approach is kind of starting with the 30,000-foot view to determine how we should possibly prioritize active and passive management based on variation from region to region. So what we do in North New Jersey may not be the same thing we do in Southern New Jersey in terms of our breakdown of active and passive management. And so one example of this might be that we decide to designate a higher percentage of state lands in the southern part of the state, put more of that into conservation area so that we can practice fuels reduction treatments to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire, disturbing and destroying large swaths of forest and potentially spreading into vulnerable residential communities. So that would just be, obviously I'm taking an example that's very near and dear to me. I don't see, it doesn't make any sense to have a constant proportional breakdown of conservation area and preservation area. We're not going to say 70% in protection area and 30% in conservation area in all state lands, right? That wouldn't make sense. It's a one size fits all. Again, we want to avoid that kind of thing. We want to practice it where it makes sense to do it. And that's kind of, again, part of that comprehensive strategy. That comprehensive strategy idea still does not, in my mind at least, does not preclude forest level planning. Like you still need to develop plans that are specific to say Wharton State Forest. That's not going to be the same plan that you would put together for Stoke State Forest, right? So they're different forest types, different concerns and opportunities and stuff. So it's going to have, obviously there's going to be nuance to those plans that are going to be forest specific. So just to kind of wrap things up, kind of what I'm really talking about in this case is trying to achieve optimization, not maximization of ecosystem services. So it's really about trying to optimize multiple goals and objectives, not so much trying to maximize any one or relatively few. So by just the nature of it, this is going to require us on our state lands to maintain less than maximum forest carbon storage in order to ensure that we're creating habitat to conserve our native biodiversity, yet also practice science-based silviculture for reducing forest health threats, including things like wildfire down here in South Jersey. I also see the importance of maintaining high forest carbon storage on all state lands, right? I think that's really important. But I don't think we have to push like maximum carbon storage. I think we can maintain really high levels and be satisfied that we are kind of addressing climate regulation, yet still creating habitat and also improving, say, climate change adaptation, that kind of thing. So just to wrap things up, that's essentially kind of what I was putting out there as part of this proposal. I hope this clarified some things for folks, and I look forward to hearing the other proposals.
Great, thank you, Matt. Up next, we have Ken with proposals number 27, 28, 29. So 27 being maximize carbon storage and sequestration by banning harvesting trees on public lands. Then Ken, you're going to continue with proposal to base forestry greenhouse gases decisions only on New Jersey greenhouse gas policies and objective research. And then lastly, but not least, ban thinning of public forests, especially forest canopies as a perpetuated tool to prevent and lessen the intensity of wildfires with various accommodations in the New Jersey pinelands where needed. And Ken, you can, oh, I think you're
All right.
muted, so go ahead.
And by that time, you'll all be really, really sick and tired of hearing me. I get it. So there's something that's common to all three of my proposals. And let me just start out by saying this once. And it actually goes directly to what Matt was saying earlier. New Jersey has policies and laws that talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Part of that is a 33% increase in sequestration of carbon across public lands, not just forests, but on land, land sequestration. And in order to do that, I think New Jersey has got to maximize the amount of carbon that it stores in its forests. The amount of carbon that's got to be reduced by 2030 is 60 million metric tons. Today, we emit 100 million metric tons. So we've got to get rid of over 60 million metric tons in 8 years. I have looked at this. I am very familiar with this whole issue. I think there is probably no freaking way that New Jersey is going to achieve its goal by 2030. And it needs, every pound of carbon that we can store in forests in order to even come close to that goal. So we need to talk about quantifying these targets. When we talk about, we'll have high levels of carbon. My question is, what the hell does that mean? Let's really talk about the quantification, because that's really what the issue is. And so this proposal is based on 8 peer-reviewed studies that clearly prove that mature forests store and sequester more carbon than young forests per unit of time over a unit of land area. Therefore, because older forests store and sequester more carbon than young forests, this requires a policy of allowing forests to mature and a ban on harvesting and extraction of wood. It doesn't mean a ban on other ecological management of land. It's just saying the one thing that we have to stop doing is cutting and extracting wood. Now, there have been a lot of studies in the past, or I should say there have been some studies in the past that said that the rate of sequestration slowed down as trees matured, and therefore assumed that young trees were preferred for sequestration. But new studies, and I've got 8 of them in my proposal here, have shown that the volume of carbon sequestered in old forests continues to grow faster than in young forests for hundreds of years. And there's maybe a lot of controversy over that, at which, the age at which forests sequester the most carbon. But the confusion arises because while young trees grow in height faster than old trees, then the rate of sequestration in a young forest can be high. However, it's not the rate that we're interested in, but it's the volume. It's not how fast carbon deposits are made, but how large these deposits are. And young forests are very limited in the size of the deposits they can make. And there were a number of factors that are listed in my proposal from one of the studies that talked about why some of the earlier studies got it wrong. And you can read that, and I won't go through them necessarily. But I'm going to read you what Dr. Beverly Law wrote based on the study that she did. She said, the theory has always been that old forests are net carbon sources to the atmosphere, or they are net zero. If they're sources, it means they give up more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than they take up. And that was based on some fairly crude measurements decades and decades ago. In her study, she said, we found that this site, a young forest, was a net carbon source, not taking up as much carbon for photosynthesis as is given off by respiration from the soil and the trees for about the first 20 years. So basically what she's saying is that when you log an area, you cut it, you've got to not, you don't develop a carbon sink. You actually have a source that's emitting more carbon into the air. People are being told, they're thought that young trees grow fast and vigorous. But when you look at the forest, the net of all the respiration and photosynthesis makes them a source. Why is there less photosynthesis in this forest? The easy way to think of it is you look at the leaf area and you see all this open space on the ground. It means that the forest has not reached canopy closure. So that's what the trees have to photosynthesize with. Okay, it's the leaf area that sucks in the carbon. So they're not taking very much carbon up, but they're still releasing a lot of it from the soil, and they're still respiring maybe 80% of what they take up. So a number of studies said that basically, if you cut trees, you basically have a carbon, a carbon emission environment for 20 or 30 years. And it could take up to 60 years for that same area to regrow and to sequester as much carbon as was released when the tree was cut, when the forest was originally cut down. So even though old forests may sequester at a slower rate than younger forests, they still sequester much more carbon per unit area than young forests. And this lasts for hundreds of years. We're not talking about, slowing down at, or, having a transition at age 75 or age 100, that for hundreds of years, these trees will add much more carbon than young forests on an annual basis. And active forest management decreases storage and sequestration. That all these studies said that when you manage and you cut forests, you're actually decreasing the amount of carbon that's stored, and you're decreasing the ability of forests to sequester carbon. So the bottom line for this, and what I had done in this report, or in this proposal, was I created my own document that took a lot of the key findings from the 8 or so studies, and I put them into one document so it's easy to read. You don't have to read all 8 studies. And basically, you'll see all this right in the document with all these sources cited, with all these statements demonstrating that old forests are going to be the source that is going to get us, if we're going to get to the target that we've been talking about for New Jersey to cut greenhouse gases, and part of that is to increase sequestration. The only way we're going to do it is to maximize the carbon in our forests, and that means not cutting forests. Okay, so that's the first proposal. The second proposal is that we need to base our forestry greenhouse gas related decisions only on New Jersey greenhouse gas policies and rigorous objective scientific analysis. The DEP and the DEP and Fish and Wildlife Forest Management carbon storage and sequestration policies have to be based on, again, minimizing greenhouse gas emissions and maximizing carbon storage to achieve the goals that we have in New Jersey. We heard in the presentations from the DEP 3 rationales for logging. One was that local logging lowers greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation of wood from other states. And if we don't log lands in New Jersey, logging is going to increase elsewhere to meet the demand for wood products, so we might as well log here. The second is that carbon is stored in wood products and justifies logging, and that logging and storing carbon in wood products is more effective at increasing carbon storage and sequestration than not harvesting forests. And the third was the idea that alternative building products such as steel and cement have more energy stored in them, or energy used to create them. And so we're better off using wood for construction because it takes less energy in order to create wood. So first of all, the first 2 of these, let's log New Jersey because it'll cut down on carbon elsewhere. And the second, that we're going to store carbon in wood in order to justify logging. Those 2 basically violate the state policies that I described earlier that says we have to maximize our own sequestration. And the third one also has some aspects of it that also violate our own state policies. So on the first, the idea about we should log locally, even if New Jersey policy supported local logging to prevent the importation of wood, The DEP would have to develop and implement a program to track this. They would have to prohibit importation of firewood. They would have to track logged wood to ensure it does not leave the state, and that wood products are being produced and sold in the state versus purchased elsewhere. And they have to measure and report on all these costs to import wood from plantation states versus local sources. Basically, this would be virtually impossible. And especially with the DEP's budget, it's extremely unlikely that this would be funded. And New Jersey doesn't have the money to support its public parks. So even if this were not a violation of New Jersey's stated policy in Executive Order 274, which is the 50% by 2030 reduction of greenhouse gases, it would be virtually impossible to manage these arguments and be able to demonstrate that we are actually reducing greenhouse gases because we're logging locally. The second argument on wood products, a number of studies have shown that it is a fallacy to think that you are net storing more carbon because you use some of the wood that you cut down and use it for wood products. There was a study that was done that there was one study that was done that showed that in Oregon, only 19% of the wood that was logged over the past 115 years is stored in long-lived products, and the rest of it is in landfills and the atmosphere. There was another study by Ann Ingerson entitled Carbon Storage Potential of Harvest Wood that says, as a result of wood waste and decomposition, the carbon stored in long-term in harvested wood products may be a small proportion of that originally stored in the standing trees. Across the United States, approximately 1% may remain in products in use and 13% in landfills at 100 years post-harvest. Related processing and transportation emissions may in some cases approach the amount of CO2 stored in long-lived solid wood products. So, and then there was a letter from over 200 US climate scientists who stated, the logging and wood products industry suggests that most of the carbon in trees that are logged and removed from forests will simply be stored in cross-laminated timber and other wood products for buildings instead of being stored in forest ecosystems. However, this is clearly incorrect. Up to 40% of the harvested material does not become forest products and is burned or decomposes quickly, and a majority of manufacturing waste is burned for heat. So the idea that wood products make up a significant amount of sequestrated carbon is a fallacy. The third argument has to do, and this one gets very complicated, so I'm not going to get into the details, but the argument is that cement and steel, because they're very energy intensive, should be replaced by wood. So there was a study that was done that stated that the wood products industry claims that substituting wood for concrete and steel reduces the overall carbon footprint of buildings. However, this claim has been refuted by more recent analyses that reveal forest industries have been using unrealistic and erroneous assumptions in their models, overestimating the long-term mitigation benefits of substituting wood for these other products by 2 to 100-fold. And one of the important issues here is the fact that over the next 20, 30 years, we are going to be dramatically increasing our use of renewable energy. And so cement and steel will be using solar and wind, or energy from solar and wind, and not fossil fuels, which makes all the difference in whether it makes any sense to use them in place of wood or not. And the last time I looked, there were no steel mills in New Jersey, and there's no increase in sequestration in New Jersey from using steel produced elsewhere. So the idea that we would replace steel with wood and get a reduction of greenhouse gases in New Jersey makes no sense. There was a lot of other information that on that study, which you can read about, but basically the bottom line in all this is that if the DEP is going to make arguments like for these kinds of uses, they have to do their homework, they have to do the science, they have to produce the data, they have to demonstrate the assumptions that they're using, and it has to stand up to peer-reviewed level scrutiny before we can believe that it's actually going to work. And the final use on this is that the DEP has to demonstrate that it needs to log public land for any of these purposes, and that they cannot get some of these potential benefits, even if there are any, from private land.
Ken, is this still your second proposal?
Yes, so I'm done with the second proposal.
Yeah, if you could just be quicker on the last one, just in the interest of time.
So the last one is that we should ban thinning of public forests because it is not useful as a way of lessening the intensity of wildfires. So there were a lot of studies that were done on fires out west. Basically, the answer is that thinning is oversold as a treatment, does little to stop wildfire or make it burn less intensely. In fact, the major driver of the western fires is climate change, not unthinned or unmanaged forests. A 2016 review of 1,500 fires found that fire severity was higher in areas treated by fuel reductions compared to wilderness and parks where no logging is allowed. And so I'll just give you the highlights of some of the other findings. Thinning removes much more carbon than fire. Okay, so if you thin, you're going to take down, you reduce sequestration much more than fire ever would. More areas are removed because of thinning than would normally burn. Thinning also promotes intense burning because it dries out the land, it dries out the soil, and allows it to burn much more intensely. That was a widespread finding about the forest out west. Thinning also removes the most fire-resistant trees. So the trees that you want to keep that are unlikely to burn, which are the mature old trees, are going to be the first ones that are removed in thinning because they're the most valuable. Despite thinning, annual burn areas continue to set records out west. And there's a very weak relationship between the areas that were logged and thinned out west and the extent and severity of fires. And lastly, we're not looking at a situation like, the northern New Jersey or New Jersey is not like Western US. We don't have a 1,000-year drought. There was a report that shows some of the fire risks in northern and central New Jersey are very minimal. And we should not be managing our forests to, because we're concerned about the catastrophic types of fires that are happening out west. So with that, that's it. I'll finish presenting these three proposals. They basically all address the idea that you have to keep your forests together. You have to stop logging if you're going to meet your climate change goals.
Thank you, Ken. Up next is Leslie Sauer with two proposals recognizing the urgency of climate change and the biodiversity crisis. The state designates all publicly owned forests as forest carbon reserves. And then the second, ecological and science-based monitoring and management are needed in New Jersey's protected forests in order to realize their highest ecological potential. So Leslie, you are not muted, so please go ahead.
Thank you. And I'm very happy to follow on from Ken because I really want to follow on exactly the same issues, which is our need to really maximize carbon sequestration in our public forests, in part because of the urgency. I'm amazed how long we've gone without even talking about how serious this problem is. Sometimes I feel like a lot of these suggestions are about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And I really think that it's important for us, and I'm very glad we are getting to this in this session. Our forests on public lands that have been protected from harvesting by green acres for more than a half a century are just reaching their prime. And these forests should be protected as forest carbon reserves. We don't have the opportunity to declare this control over private lands. We do over public lands. And I'm going to use what is a bad word to many people. Proforestation is how these lands have been managed. That is, they have been protected forest. Timber products have not been removed. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago that these sites were managed with much of anything besides proforestation. All that means is protect forest. Just like afforestation and reforestation are about growing forests. Then it's not a conservation measure. It is the oldest conservation technique that we've probably ever used, from princes protecting their hunting grounds to green acres. And we have achieved creating a forest that is absolutely at the beginning of its best years for maximum sequestration. So I think it's really an astonishing opportunity that we can't miss. the value of this wood is much greater as carbon than it is as a wood product that's being sold. And it's very important to remember, it's not just above ground wood, it's all the carbon that is stored below ground in the roots and in soil carbon. It's one of the reasons you don't want to salvage log. If you leave the logs eaten by insects, et cetera, behind or charred, they will much more rapidly turn into sequestered soil and root products than they will, they're just lost to carbon if they are salvaged or taken out of that. The same problem with the carbon offense strategy, the idea of cutting forests now to avoid future carbon losses. I see absolutely no evidence that this is even a remotely reasonable policy. Our forests need restoration to receive their full ecological value, which is the goal of proforestation protection. New Jersey's forests are severely compromised by deer overpopulations, and many of our forests are empty or basically infested. Storms and pests and disease and saltwater intrusion have all added to these tree losses and a growing number of gaps. These forests are more important than ever. And with only 20% of the state in public forest, I don't think it's too much to ask that we put a million plus acres into carbon reserves. I do want to stress, though, with my second proposal, that what we have learned is that in New Jersey, just protecting forests is not enough. Our forests have been very seriously damaged by things that are not related to silviculture, but are related to climate change, such as the ghost forests and saltwater intrusion, deer, which is possibly the single biggest management issue, period, and the one that we could have total control over, and as well as exotics, which we have completely ignored in terms of management and continue to introduce in the state willy-nilly. So I do think we really need to first study these landscapes before we talk about manipulating them and playing with them. We really have very little information. The pinelands, I think, is better known than the northern forests. But the idea that we really know that much about them right now is just not true. We really need to protect them, and our first goal should be studying them, documenting them, looking at the vermeule sites, really getting into ecological inventory that looks at all the species before we go further. I think another important thought is we kind of think of ourselves as a dinky little New Jersey, even dinky little temperate forest. The temperate forest might be the third and smallest forest system on the planet, but we are doing better than the others. The the boreal forests are burning. The forests in the tropical areas are burning. We actually may be one of the most resilient landscapes in this overall long-term struggle, which makes it even more important that we take the time to protect our forests. And I think we have to understand that by saving the forest, we give it a chance to save itself. We are seeing that adaptations to beetle and things like that are doing far better than any efforts to out clear the journey. We are seeing that prescribed burning is the one really effective way to master fire, but it won't stop wildfire, and that thinning will actually make wildfire worse. So these are important things. Resilience is all about New Jersey's forests, which are at their most resilient time, and we need them absolutely more than ever. And a varied management that does not include the removal of wood products would allow us to do everything we need to do to retain ecological diversity, variety, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie.
You're
Then we're moving into Sarah Webb with 2 proposals for forests of New Jersey's public conservation lands to not permit logging management. And then her last one, reduce conversion of all forests to young. Sarah, if you can raise your hand, I don't
Oh, yes.
see you. Oh, you're not on mute. Okay, go ahead.
I'm not unmuted, but I've got to get my camera on here. Hang on a second. Here we go.
Mhm.
Yes. Well, as
Yes,
many of my students heard me say during discussion, what they said. Leslie just put so many important aspects of this discussion into very clear relief, and I will do my best not to overlap and duplicate too much what she has said. I have a few things to add to that discussion that I will try to see my notes here while I'm also looking at all of you. My first proposal, before I start my proposals, I'll just say in overview that it's good to keep in mind the reason why we're all here. We're all here, we're having this task force process because there was legislation proposed, and that proposed legislation was calling for forest stewardship plans on all of our public lands in New Jersey. And the problem is that forest stewardship plans have become timber removal logging plans, as many of you probably realize. And so there was a groundswell of support, of opposition to that legislation. People in New Jersey, people with higher degrees and education and skills like myself, and people who don't know that much science but have good instincts and values, did not want to see this logging, which has already been going on in our northern New Jersey forests at quite an astonishing intensity. And so whether it's a visceral reaction or a scientific reaction, we have brought ourselves to a place now where Senator Smith said, okay, I'm withdrawing this legislation. We're going to have a discussion. We're going to have a task force. So this is today now getting to the heart of why we are here. And I want to say, before I say more, that a couple of things. First of all, the task force leaders, I thank you for a brilliant job you're doing. And from the start, you have said that these decisions should be made on the basis of science, peer-reviewed science, and I couldn't agree more. And one of the things you'll find in my posting is a set of articles that some of which probably overlap with those others have posted, that are in that peer-reviewed scientific literature that have been reviewed anonymously and put in scientific journals that are as objective as we get in the world today. And they bolster many of the things that Leslie has said, and Ken and others have said. Many of the things are bolstered by them as well, but they're really very compelling. And some titles just quickly that I'll urge you to go look at include old growth forests as carbon sinks globally, rate of tree carbon accumulation increases continuously with tree size. What's this? Below ground carbon trade among tall trees and temperate forests. Degradation and foreground removals increase the carbon impact of forest loss by 626%, and so on. So those articles, I really hope people will go and take a look as you're formulating your views on what we're doing, because that's really where we're finding the data that support this need to stop the logging approach to our forests. I want to say also, and with a nod to Matt, that I'm not talking about stopping logging everywhere. My first proposal has a sort of controversial title of, for forests of New Jersey's public conservation lands do not permit logging management. And the caveat, one of the caveats would of course be to focus on the pinelands as a different sort of ecosystem. And we have many different kinds of forests in the state, and the pinelands ecosystem, fire adapted, with disturbance and openings being an important part of their ecology, but really focusing on northern and north central New Jersey is where the policies would apply that I'm going to talk about. So there's an inflammatory statement: do not permit logging management, and do not. And often we don't talk about logging. That logging word is never said in the plans that we have been seeing and that have been implemented. But the activity on the ground is what most people would call logging. These are usually called stewardship plans, sometimes habitat management plans or management plans, but they are whatever the name is. What's been going on that we need to take a really close look at is those practices that involve cutting, clearing, thinning our native large mature trees from our conservation areas, from our public lands at least, whether it's small acreages being cleared or large acreages, because the small openings cause a lot of damage in today's environment, as you've already heard, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, more. But there's this groundswell of concern, so we really need to work on keeping our climate resilience bolstered by protecting these mature established forests as best we can. And we also need to protect those forest interior species and ecosystems. I think some people who get to work in the forests of northern New Jersey and the South perhaps get a sense we have plenty of forest, but if you look at the big picture, we really don't. And here in the northeastern part of the state where I work, everything's empty understory, deer, invasive species. And what we have in our public forests and state wildlife management areas is really quite spectacular. However, even those forests have what we call the empty understory syndrome. That is, we have invasive species coming in wherever there are openings. And of course, we have our friend the deer, which we all struggle with in our efforts to preserve forests. So one of the problems with the logging approach is that it exacerbates those two problems dramatically. So if you cut down the canopy of a forest and say Sparta Mountain National Wildlife Refuge, where I've spent quite a bit of time counting tree rings and doing surveys, you are not going to get a new oak forest or any other kind of forest established because of our deer without a huge amount of effort, nor are you going to avoid the invasive species choking everything out. I'm doing restoration ecology in Morris County and the Drew University Forest Preserve, and you've got to have a deer fence, and you can't do that over vast acreages very easily. And herbicide use, of course, is problematic. So it's best just to keep the canopy intact. So I really don't believe we should be allowing this kind of logging management, except in very extraordinary circumstances, whatever you call it. We have very little of that old forest, but lots of edge, lots of degraded woodlands. So I believe we need to have new policies that will keep those mature canopy trees and those biodiverse natural forests intact. Not to replace with young forests, that's my second proposal, but I'll kind of combine them, I guess. Not for early successional wildlife. That's less imperiled in this state, despite some of the claims that we hear, than our forest edge species. And not for commercial logging, certainly, but even logging management that's well-intended is not right for those intact, mature public forests of northern New Jersey. You've already heard the science is really clear on this. I'm not going to go on to that, but I do want to talk about climate because it's a new era that we're in as well from that perspective. We are in crisis, as Leslie and others have said, and our forest ecosystems can store, and our trees can store carbon for centuries. For something like 87% of tree species on the planet, sequestration, storage, uptake of carbon increases as they get older, ever increasing as they get older and larger. There are some claims around that younger forests and younger trees will take up more carbon or store more carbon or both at a higher rate or more per acre. And that is not true if you scrutinize the scientific literature. The actual uptake rate is higher proportionally to the leaf area of a tree. And it also, the storage is phenomenally greater, so that trees that get older do accumulate more storage. Now, if you're comparing this with a timber situation in a plantation where you're trying to produce wood, thinning is appropriate, trying to get as much board feet of timber as you can. But when you're in a natural forest, you have a lot of other pools of carbon, and that is just not going to be a good thing to be cutting down trees to thin when you have ecological and climate resilience goals here, as we have here in New
Sarah?
Jersey.
Yeah,
Sarah,
go ahead,
Yes.
no, I was just going to say
Okay.
that be mindful of time because we're running over.
Okay,
Take
how long? have
30
I used-
seconds. Yeah, it's been like 9 minutes. It's okay. Take about
Oh.
30 seconds. That'd be
Oh,
great.
no, and I haven't even talked about my second proposal, but it's very integrated. So I will speed up, and I recognize there's overlap between what many of us are saying. I think the second proposal I have is reduce conversion of old forest to young forest. When we need or want young forest or edge habitat, we need to go elsewhere, create it out of our disturbed lands that already have invasive trees on them, the former agricultural lands, and not carve them out of our intact forests, because those openings, as I said before, are going to bring in lots of deer and invasive species. And so I have the impression, and I'll finish on this note, that we had more young forest in New Jersey in the past than we have today. And we have too much old forest, and we need to get that diversification back. But if you look back in history, there's very strong paleoecological and archaeological evidence, that's one of my specialties, that there was much less young forest on the eastern landscape before European settlement than there is even today. And so that is an artifact of colonization. And what we had is unbroken forest that is intact. So I will just conclude by thanking you all for listening and urge everyone to move our state toward prioritizing preserving the forest interior habitat over earliest successional species and protecting our carbon sequestration engine as well as our biodiversity preserves. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So now we're gonna go into our clarifying questions and just questions overall from all of you guys. So you can raise your hand and we will ask to unmute yourself. So Donald, I have you first, so please go ahead and you can unmute yourself now.
Okay, I have a couple of things to bring up. First, addressing Sarah Webb's discussion, just to kind of put some context on the idea of logging and how much occurs. If we look at the FIA data, which is the Forest Inventory and Analysis data for the state of New Jersey, there's less than 0.1% of the forest land in the state of New Jersey is affected by tree removals. Tree removals are defined as anything greater than 5 inches in diameter, and it applies to projects that aren't forestry related. So if a piece of land was cleared, it falls under the tree removal category if it was cleared for development. So the fraction of acreage that's actually affected by forestry practices is far less than 0.1% of the forest landmass. If we take in the state lands into that, it's about 0.005% of that 0.1%. So we're talking about such an infinitesimal amount of land that's being made out to be something large. It's almost even a non-issue. The second point is directly about the Sporta project, and I know firsthand because I ran the Sporta project for 10 years, and the claim that these sites don't regenerate is erroneous. I had several of the people on this call out with me about a week ago, including Emil DeVito and Leslie Sauer, who expressed how great the regeneration was there of oak at these sites. So if we want to keep pretending that these sites aren't regenerated and they're not successful, I'd put those two people on point to either confirm that you're correct, Sarah, or that I'm correct, that they are regenerating. And the last point for Sarah I'd like to make is she's referenced these paleo studies from pre-European history. And it's clear that we had oak forests for at least 10,000 years, which is long before European settlement. And we know from the silviculture of oak that they cannot regenerate under an intact closed canopy forest. It is impossible to sustain oak forest for 10,000 years if that wasn't an open forest type that was sustained in northern New Jersey through Native American burning to keep an open, partially open forest. So, those are all points that I want to make because I keep hearing all this talk about logging, and it's really such a small piece of the puzzle here that it's even a non-issue. To Leslie's points, she's talked about we should have all these forest reserves and admitted that for the past 50 years, proforestation has been the operative land management tool in New Jersey. So I would point the question, if for the past 50 years we've been under proforestation, and I think there's unanimous agreement by forest ecologists throughout the state that our forests continue to decline, we continue to see a lack of sustainability, the forests are not regenerating on their own, and we continue to see, a loss of biodiversity. What would make you think that if we continue the policy of proforestation for the next 50 years, that our forests are miraculously going to get better on their own all of a sudden? And then the last thing was to Ken's points. Ken, one example that you talked about how solar and renewable energy will be able to replace steel instead of using wood products for this. And I would like to know exactly how using solar panels or any kind of renewable energy is going to replace steel I-beams when we're constructing a building, and how that is a better replacement than wood. So I just, as I'm hearing this, I hear all these points. There's a lot more that I would like to bring up, but those are just a couple highlights to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, you can unmute yourself, Sarah. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for your comments, Don. So I know we disagree about quite a few things, Don, and you make good points. I want to say about these FIA data about how little of our state is logged. We are looking at the conservation lands in northern New Jersey, such as Sparta Mountain Wildlife Management Area, which Don knows well. And other people have been there, as well as other wildlife management agencies. Marlin Dickerson Park are some of our state forests. There's a steady drumbeat of logging management. It's not called that, it's called stewardship, but I have been on the site as with Don and otherwise to see vast clearings that are much larger than anything nature would produce. And trees being cut that are said to be even aged and stuck. And there are 150 tree rings on these stumps, or 120, depending on which sand you're in. They're quite ancient, they're well established. And to clear one huge section after another every year until the whole place is logged over. We've negotiated, perhaps, we being the Highlands Coalition and other scientists, perhaps a reduction in that. But the very idea that those forests are being treated with what cannot be called anything other than logging. The logs are removed by heavy equipment. There's running of the paths, which are lost to recreational use. So it's not just a small part of what's going on in the state. I will just say also the forest FIA data are very broad in general and not very accurate for New Jersey. So I wouldn't rely on those. I will finally say that if it's not true that the forest ecologists of the state would agree that our forests are in decline, that we need to cut to have more oak trees, because I know that the focus of these stewardship projects is to try to get oaks back, but you're not going to get the oaks back by cutting the forest because of the deer and the invasive species. And to cut the big oaks in order to get more oaks does not make sense. If we want to get more oak forest back, let's start growing it on these disturbed lands that are so abundant across New Jersey. I know it's hard. You have to protect them from deer and you have to protect them from invasive species. You're going to have to do that at Sparta Mountain too, at the intensity of logging that's going on there now. So I just share that perspective, which is a different worldview than Don's, I recognize. Thank you.
Leslie, I don't know if you want to answer some of Don's comments. I'm going to ask.
Yeah, I replied to 3 of the things he said. Yes, I was on the field trip with Emil. And yes, there was a lot of sprouting in the areas that had been cut. I did send out a summary after the visit. And my core criticism was that these trees are so large and sprout so rapidly that the benefits of the open landscape are extremely short-lived. And it's a very heavy price to pay with such large trees to make such a short-term successional landscape. I did recommend more management of the existing successional landscapes they've created. The site we looked at, if it was burned, and the other sites we looked at, they could actually be maintained as successional landscapes. And I think those are the kinds of things we do have to think about. I agree with him that we have learned the limitations of proforestation in the last 50 years. We have learned that we need to introduce ecological management. We need to manage deer. But none of the things that even he was talking about is silviculture going to help. Silviculture is going to reduce the amount of sequestration, increase the impacts from deer and the vulnerability to fire. And I don't think it's the way to go. And regardless of what the current FIA data is, there are people here presenting the ideas of opening up fairly significant areas of our public forest to logging. And that's exactly what most of us are trying to stop.
And then I'm gonna give a chance. Ken, do you want to respond to Don's comments, questions?
Yeah, so 2 things. So one was the question about the use of steel and cement versus wood. And that may have been a problem. I was talking very fast, and so it may have been hard to follow. So the argument is we should stop using steel and cement to a certain extent because they're very energy intensive to produce. And that energy is provided by fossil fuels today. So there's a lot of greenhouse gases that are emitted in the production of steel and cement, whereas wood is just the opposite. It doesn't produce any greenhouse gases and does, exactly the opposite. However, over time, as we move to more renewable energy sources, as we move to more solar and wind, the amount of energy needed to produce steel and cement won't change, but that energy will come from renewable sources that are not producing greenhouse gases. And so therefore, there will not be any reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or any benefit to climate change to use wood from trees instead of cement and steel, as long as they're produced without greenhouse gas emissions. So that was the argument there. The second thing I'd just like to address is I understand what you're saying about the extent to which the percent of land that's been logged in New Jersey is today. But we saw what happens when people are able to make introduce suggested laws to the legislature, and as we saw last year, there was laws being proposed that would have dramatically increased the amount of areas that would have been forced to have forest stewardship plans, which could have been logged, and that would have been hundreds of thousands. Well, that would have been an enormous percentage increase over what we see today. And so if we don't control this by law and prevent that from happening, who's to say that kind of legislation wouldn't be introduced again? Thank you.
Thank you, Ken and Don. Don, I'm going to assume that you want to respond, but in the interest of time, we want to give opportunity to everybody to ask more questions, right, Andy? Is that
Correct.
good?
Yeah, we need to get moving. Yep. More questions.
Bill, so you are up next, and Don will get to you as we go in order.
Thanks, Anjali. I had two issues that I wanted to raise. I appreciate everyone's proposals. I appreciate Ken's proposals, but his second proposal helps illustrate my first issue, the first thing I wanted to talk about briefly, and that's the proposal to base forestry decisions on greenhouse gas policy exclusively. And I recognize the context of the discussion we're having at these meetings, and I feel a little silly doing this, but I feel obliged to remind everybody that sequestering carbon is not the only function of forests. They provide a lot of other critical services to us and the planet as a whole, generating oxygen, protecting soils, filtering water, as just a few examples. I recognize that much of this conversation is in the context of climate change, but I think it's important while we're having that discussion that we don't lose sight of the forest for the trees, if you'll pardon me, and that there are other critical functions of forests. The second issue that I wanted to raise follows on that, because the conversation oftentimes comes up in the context of ecosystem services, which can be a useful tool to understand what forests do for us, but is limited by the fact that it doesn't really recognize that forests and the living things that inhabit forests have inherent worth on their own. They are not limited by the value they provide to us. And you may consider that an ethical decision, the question of moral values or religious principles. However you want to look at it, I realize it's difficult to come up with peer-reviewed scientific studies on philosophical issues, but there is more to a forest than what it does for us, and there is more to a forest than what it does for sequestering carbon. That's all I had, so thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to Bill's comments. Ken?
Yeah, so I would just quickly say that we certainly value all the other ecosystem services that forests provide. And I think if we should get down to a real nitty gritty, like at the 1 foot level discussion about what kinds of ecosystem services are being lost if we can't log. And if we can't cut, 10-acre swaths in the forest. I know that proforestation is a very tainted word, but I think that virtually all the ecosystem service support that you want to provide is still available as part of, a proforestation scenario. So we need to see exactly what it is that we would lose if we couldn't log. And not just, at high level discussions about resilience and, active versus passive, but, right down there on the ground level, what would we lose?
Okay, thank you, Ken. Theodore, you're next. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to address the word thinning. And I appreciate that I think Ken in particular and probably others mean by thinning the removal of some mature trees instead of all mature trees. And I would quite agree that we shouldn't be doing that. But there's another sort of thinning, which is perhaps removing, of course, invasive species and some perhaps shrubs and things in order to allow the real trees, so to speak, to reach maturity and fix more carbon. I'll give a sort of an example. Years ago, I was in Newfoundland with Roger Lacandro of Rutgers. I trust there are some people out there who know Roger. And we visited a forest that was pretty much silviculture for paper production. But the forest steward, I forget just what the word would be, made the point that after they'd clear cut and they would reseed, then they would come back in 10 to 15 years and they would remove some of the young trees there and the other ones would grow that much faster to the point that in their thinking of when is it ready to harvest again, it would be in 45 years rather than 70. Now, don't be put off by my bringing up an example from extreme silviculture, but it may be that some thinning of some trees, smaller trees, will allow the other trees to grow faster and fix more carbon. At least it might be something worth studying. Apart from that, I see really a basic distinction whether we're going to really designate some areas for some other stages of forest than mature forests. I think this was really Matt's point. And others, Ken and Sarah, I think Leslie would say, no, we ought to designate everything for carbon fixation and do proforestation on everything. And I would stand with that, although it might be harder to sell politically. It may be that we have to phrase it in some different words, but I think that's the basic question that's got to be resolved in this study. Thanks.
Hey, Angelique, can I just say something real quick? So
Sure, go ahead.
remember, this is clarifying questions, not so much commentary, okay? So we haven't really had a lot of questions asked. We've had more just comments. So questions would be great at this point. Thank you.
Laura, you can unmute yourself.
I have a question. I think many people here know that forestry is exempt from the flood hazard rules, presumably to increase the potential harvest. And in the highlands, forests are often on steep slopes. Do either Sarah or Leslie have any insight or comments on the effects of clearing forests versus leaving forests intact in regard to flood hazards in New Jersey? I live on the Delaware River and I have a keen interest in mitigating flood hazards. The state is also looking very hard at flood mitigation in the face of projected increased rainfall in New Jersey due to climate change. So I'd be interested in some conversation about clearing forests versus intact forests in regard to flood hazard mitigation.
Shall I respond to that?
Please.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important point that we're facing record downpours and definitely having forest intact, the trees, their roots, and the understory layers holding things together is really valuable on the steep slopes that we have in highlands and also in other areas as well. And to that same point, keeping the forest intact with its layers and of course its underground parts that it's brought so much carbon into from the big trees, really helpful to reducing erosion and recharging our water supplies across the state. I don't think this has come up today, that one of the problems with today's management approach by logging or stewardship by logging is that it does have a very big effect on our water supplies, underground water, and in the highlands in particular, the reservoirs that supply so many people with their water. So that is a reason to not have a logging management. And even going back to the previous question about thinning, that's another reason to keep the different layers of the forest there. And certainly when there are invasive shrubs and trees present, that should certainly be allowed to remove those. But for the whole ecosystem, for the water, for the soil, and for the organisms that need that forest interior, I would say it's best to keep the trees in place. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Leslie, do you want to add something to this? Or you're good?
I was actually responding to something earlier. I would agree completely with what Sarah has talked about. But vis-a-vis the earlier discussion about biodiversity and habitat management, I think one of the core questions that's sort of embodied in what Ken was saying is, what can't you do another way? I don't need to clear large trees to pay for a young forest if I can make a young forest. And I have yet to see one thing that they claim can only be done by silviculture that can't be done in another way that does not involve such serious impacts to climate issues.
Thank you, Leslie. Julia, no, you don't have a question?
I do.
Lower your hand. Sorry, that's why I'm asking. But go ahead.
Sorry. My question actually is of the task force leadership, because I'm very confused. We all prepared for today, assuming that we were going to just be asking questions, but the very first question wasn't a question. It was a series of statements. And will that continue in the future?
What was the first question?
It was Don Donnelly's response to.
I think it would be fair to say that we've had a lot of commentary from several people. And we are trying hard to promote people asking questions. So thank you for bringing that up, Julia. I do think we get off the rails when we just share commentary and we don't ask clarifying questions. But it's safe to say that it's not one person, it's several people. So
fair, but we just got off, we started that way, and I think we continued that way. And my second question is, it's actually generated from the comments that Tom Gilbert made earlier about consensus. If you put up a question on an issue, but it's hard to tell what the big picture is. For instance, if you ask us if we're going to support an issue about raising funds to help fund planning, but we don't know in what context. Yeah, I suppose we support raising funds, but depends what you're going to use it for. So it's really hard to vote. And that brings up the other question. Have you any idea what your decision around voting is? I only ask because that sort of is another one of those things that's hanging over everything. I recognize this is not a comment for a question for our speakers. My question, and thanks for the speakers, is this is one of the first times we've heard science introduced for everything. How can we make sure that that continues?
Okay. As far as voting goes, we will have a discussion about that at the end of the meeting. So,
Okay, thank you.
mhm. So, anything else, Anjali? Sorry if I missed something else that Julie asked.
Well, it was the issue of science. How can we make sure that all the proposals include the scientific rationale?
I'd like to take that one. As you
Yeah,
can
go
see
ahead,
from
Eileen.
the makeup of this task force, this is not an expert panel. This is not a panel of experts. It's a stakeholder process. So some people have that science background and provide it, but we're not ranking people who have an interest but not an expertise also have a say. So this is more of a stakeholder process than an expert panel. So I ask you to just keep that in mind. Some people are going to present peer-reviewed literature. We've seen it, and that's a good thing. But some people don't have that capacity, and that's okay too, because it is in the end a stakeholder process. I hope that addressed your question.
Well, we're obviously all hoping that when you are proposing something to the senator, that it will be scientifically supported.
Well, it'll be based on this stakeholder process. It'll be based on what we hear from you, not on a panel of experts. It'll be based on on all of you.
That's kind of hard to support, but okay. Thank you.
I mean, if I want to add to everything that Eileen was saying. From the very beginning, we've stressed the fact that we want to base all of the recommendations and proposals on science, and that's why we were very adamant about asking references for all of the proposals. So technically, all proposals that have been accepted and that we are discussing currently are based on science. To the point of how the presenters are showcasing their ideas and their goals, and not necessarily bringing up the articles that they're quoting, that's a different story. But every single proposal that we've selected and has gone up for discussion is absolutely based on different points of view in science. I don't know if Tom, if you want to add something else.
Just then again, I think our charge from the senator was to convene a stakeholder process and to report back to him on ideas where we have consensus and where we don't have consensus. I mean, that was it. It was very specific. I think we're the ones that have injected the importance of science into the conversation, to remind all of us and to kind of hold all of our feet to the fire, to not just bring ideas forward that aren't, grounded in science. And so that's why we've been stressing that. But at the end of the day, I think, as Eileen said, this is a stakeholder process, and our charge is to let the senator know where we have consensus and where we don't. Our hope is that science is going to inform all of us in how we shape that consensus.
Andy, you're next.
Yeah, I just had a couple of questions. So my first one, let's see here, is for Sarah. How many forest stewardship plans are you familiar with?
Well, I've seen quite a lot of them over the last 10 or 15 years for various wildlife management areas, state forests, and county forests, as a matter of fact. And I've been involved with seeing many iterations of some of them, such as in Sparta Mountains. So I've seen quite a lot. And maybe I've only seen the subset that has come to the attention of the conservation community. And perhaps there are others that are not as logging intensive as the ones I've seen, but what I've seen is enough to have me very alarmed. Yeah, but probably I haven't seen as many as I haven't seen any for South Jersey, and I have a suspicion from what I've heard is that the management in South Jersey is quite relevant and based on the actual ecology of those forests. That's just my impression, though.
Got it. A follow-up to that, how I think we're all familiar that there is some harvesting taking place on Sparta Mountain. How many acres is Sparta Mountain, and about how many acres are being disturbed in the plan? Do we have a rough ballpark?
Well, someone like Julia could speak more specifically to that, but the original plans that I saw a few years back had intended to periodic or every year log out a different part of Sparta Mountain until all of it had been cleared to create young forest, and there would be a kind of rotation into the future, leaving virtually none of it unlogged. Now, I don't know that that's still in the cards. We had some great discussions with DEP people and had reached something of a plan that the total acreage would stop at 200 acres. And I don't know that that is still, my impression is that's not still on the table, but I'm not sure. So, so it depends on where at what point in time you're talking about, and how, as far as how much is still at risk. I'm concerned. Could be the whole place every year, even with many of us experts going to the sites to scope out how would we best shift things, or what's there that we should be careful about. Tree ring work, seeing the hawks and owls, even with us providing those kinds of data and observing damage to vernal pools. This planning process is still going forward on Sparta Mountain, and so I don't know where it will end up. I mean, I'm just the scientist, so we should ask Julia about that, who's probably more in touch with the DEP people directly.
It's been at least 100 acres that's been logged. Sylvia has more details.
A follow-up, where else is logging taking place on state lands besides Sparta Mountain? Do we know of any other forests?
That would be a question maybe for Julia or someone else who's more
Julia,
tap-
you want to answer that? You can unmute yourself.
Emil can do better.
Emil is good.
Emil is the better person.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Where
Weldon Brook is another example.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so very recently, there's been projects in Berkshire Valley, Weldon Brook, Sparta Mountain, another place that the name Trout is in it, but I can't remember the full name of it. Trout something in Sussex County. It might be. I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact name. There's another thing, though, that falls under the radar, which is
Stokes is another one.
Yeah, not too much. But then there's another thing that falls under the radar, which is many lands that have been acquired by Green Acres. One of the last things that happened to them once they get under contract for Green Acres is they get logged. Like in what's Rockaway River Wildlife Management Area now was formerly the Baker Firestone property, and right before Baker Firestone sold it under Green Acres, huge amounts of it were logged. So, and I frankly, I don't know how that FIA data comes up with those minuscule numbers that Don Donnelly reported, because I mean, 2/3 of all the private land that I go to when we get under contract to save land at New Jersey Conservation Foundation has been recently logged under farmland woodland assessment. So I can't imagine. I mean, and we're not talking about private lands, but what I see going on, like, you know, Leslie Sauer has said, you know, half of New Jersey's forest is private land, and most of it is getting logged in the last 60 years since the beginning of woodland assessment. I don't know how the FIA data is coming up with these minuscule numbers. I agree, though, that on public land, it's largely been pro-forestation, except we've done nothing about deer and invasive species, so things are in big trouble. I actually have some questions for for Matt Olson, but you let me know when my turn.
Thank
Roaring
you.
Rock,
I
Roaring Rock
appreciate-
Park is another example too.
Laura, I feel, I sense your urgency, please.
Thumbs up.
Well, there are a lot of municipally owned properties that are forested that are not teeny weeny either. And recently in Washington Township, for example, Roaring Rock Park, which is 400 acres, really good quality forest, was the subject of a logging plan that was defeated by the public. But the only purpose was to sell logs to make money. There really was no conservation purpose. And there was a historic, like a record in the public meetings, that the reason to cut the trees down was to get the money. And you know, what also followed when the plan was carried out was an ecological mess that didn't comply with what was stated in the plan as the protections that should have been given to C1 water. There's a mega wonderful trout fishery in Brass Castle Creek. The water there, you know, has been isolated and protected and cool for a long time. And there was like that made no difference in the plan. There was no consideration of the fishery there. Logging took place on top of tributaries to C1 water. The slash fell into the water. The trucks drove right up on top of the banks. There was no riprap or cord, there was no best management practices. So what actually happened, even if you thought that the management plan was a pretty good plan, which was questionable, they didn't even do it. And there was really no recourse for the public. The Forestry Division of Forestry considered it legal because the state forester had permitted it. So that is an example of what the public is seeing when it comes to quote unquote stewardship plans.
Thank you, Laura. Andy? You're
So
good?
yeah, what I was getting at, my line of questioning was to try to understand kind of a percentage. We use numbers like, or terms like it's happening everywhere. 100% of Sparta Mountain is going to be logged. I think we have to just be accurate when we share information. So is 100% of Sparta Mountain being logged? I don't know. I don't think so, but maybe it is. Sparta Mountain, I think, is over 3,000 acres. That's a lot of acres to log. And then is it being logged consecutively this year, or is it a small portion this year and a small portion next year, and 30 years go by and we have this, you know, this kind of mosaic of forest? So I'm just trying to understand where we're really at on this thing by asking these questions. I don't know the answers to these questions. I don't work on Sparta Mountain. Just as a side note, though, I would say this. So I'm taking off my task force hat here, and I'm just going to speak as an individual. I am a consulting forester in New Jersey who writes forest stewardship plans on private property, not public property, private property. We have written over 200 forest stewardship plans. And I would say that less than 5% of them contain language related to timber harvesting. So to equate a stewardship plan with logging is not accurate. It's not helpful. And I'm just saying that for the group. I hear it, and as somebody who does this kind of work every day, I know what's true and not true. So a forest stewardship plan, it's not required within a forest stewardship plan that it contain timber harvesting. So to just equate the two is not accurate. It's not fair. It's not right. I think we have to be careful how we use our language and how we represent these things. So that's I just wanted to use that opportunity as an aside to just share kind of my real life experience as a consulting forester. We're writing forest stewardship plans that contain all kinds of management regimes that very rarely actually contain timber harvesting.
If I could I respond to that?
Sure.
Oh, I'm muted. I'm muted.
We hear, Sarah, we hear you. Go ahead. You can unmute yourself, Sarah.
I'm sorry, Andy, if I certainly didn't mean to impugn people who are writing poor stewardship plans in general. And I'm aware that you're writing a lot of really conservation oriented, non-logging oriented stewardship plans for private lands. And so we shouldn't be using that word in that general pejorative way. But it has been used as a sort of smokescreen that placates people about what's happening on public lands. When the level of deforestation, frankly, is beyond what you could really defend from a stewardship perspective. But you're right that there's good stewardship going on, and I know that you're part of that. Sorry, apologies.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Sarah. Alex, you are next.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is actually for Matt, but there was a question about quantification, and the answer is that it's 75 acres, 75 of 3,500 acres over a decade. So that's 2.5% disturbance over the course of a decade at the project that you were just asking about. But my question is actually for Matt. So Matt, you were talking about really a landscape scale perspective and multiple tools and maintaining diversity and various approaches as all of these state forests face down climate change in the years to come. So my question is, what would you really see as like the first 3 actionable steps that your proposal would need?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I guess kind of keeping consistent with the comprehensive concept of my plan would be maybe starting with that 30,000-foot view and saying, okay, well, what areas of the state perhaps are in need of, or in greatest need of active management, right? So maybe we might kind of focus on, kind of zoning areas there a little bit differently than we would in other parts of the state. So kind of it would be maybe starting with that comprehensive 30,000-foot view, getting a sense of like maybe how this should look kind of at that scale, try to prioritize if it really makes sense to do that. But then obviously you would have to zero down on the individual land unit area to make those kinds of decisions, because every land unit's going to have its own unique nuance that you have to manage for or against or whatever it might be. So then I would think at that point it is like, okay, so if the decision is we're going to do a little bit more active management in southern New Jersey than on South Jersey, like Wharton, for example, maybe we go ahead, designate areas as conservation areas, designate areas as preservation areas, and then I guess the final step would be trying to encourage any kind of timber operators, whatever it might be. We need folks to go out there and actually do the management to actually get that stuff done. But the thing is, like, what getting stuff done, like what would actually get done, will have to be based on what's the condition on the ground and everything else.
Hey, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Matt. Joe, you're next.
Thanks, Anjali. Sorry to be driving again. The question is, would leading proponents of a variety of stewardship approaches be willing to sit in a subgroup and work out a better understanding, shared language of what type of steward should be permitted under what circumstances? The reason why I asked that question is, if you're willing to, is it seems like we're moving from proposal stage to really need working groups at this point. Because another question, does anyone really think we're going to get any consensus on a lot more stewardship planning, or that involves potentially tree removal, or a lot less in this group? My thought is no, because right now the DEP doesn't even have to visit a site on public lands for which it approves a stewardship project, and it doesn't have to visit a site for 3 full years after the project is done for verification. So without verification, without shared understanding of what a stewardship project entails and what the boundaries are, and without even knowing if they're even visiting the sites within 3 full years after it's done, without having any budget for enforcement, without shared trust, without even the DEP being able to provide data and, to us, DEP data should be answering some of these questions about how many acres and where and what. And also, when I asked John Cecil, can DEP give us a description of the regulations, he said, no, put it in a proposal. So if DEP doesn't even have the staff to to describe what the regulations are, how is he even going to be regulating any more of these stewardship projects that we have, or any new regime? So my question just goes back to, would the leading proponents of different views of what stewardship entails be willing to sit down in this process into a working group to iron out some of these vast differences that we have?
So if I hear that clear, Joe, you're proposing a subgroup, a sub-working group to iron the details out. Is that correct? You can just do the thumbs up so you don't have to. Please be safe. Yeah, okay. I mean, Andy, Tom, Eileen, this would be another subgroup. Like, what are we thinking?
I mean, my take, this is just me, Joe. There's a lot of, if I understood the question right, there is a whole ton of different approaches to managing the forest. So I feel like that's kind of what we're talking about here in this group. And a subgroup would be more appropriate to dial into a particular management kind of regime or technique, I guess you would say. I don't think a subgroup is going to be able to discuss tree removal, invasive species, like that's what this group is for. Are you suggesting dialing into a particular technique? Can you unmute or
You're
no?
muted, Joe.
Sorry.
Not quite, Andy. My suggestion is that we're not going to get our consensus for months and months if we do this. The different people who spoke today have such different sets of understandings and what stewardship entails and what the goals should be, that we're just not, we're going to have a lot of objections to a lot of what everybody says in this group. I think the people who have very different views, I'm asking if they'd be willing to sit down and try to create, at least try to find a set of shared conditions under which they could consider agreeing to somebody else. Like but there's no enforcement of stewardship plans. If there's no requirement for DEP to even visit, the only shall visit is in the first 3 years after a plan is done. What pure conservationist or what pro-forester is ever going to agree to any of the silviculturists' ideas, and vice versa? And I'm not trying not to prejudice that against one perspective or the other or anything in between. I'm just suggesting that, in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, they quickly went to working groups on just about every single topic that we ended up with in the US Constitution. I just don't see that we're going to get there this way any longer. And I hope people can sit down into real working groups with really different views.
Yeah. Joe, I hear what you're saying. I mean, I guess if I had to guess, I think you're probably right. There's like two pretty different schools of thought here that have been presented, right? And one is maximize carbon and largely kind of set aside all of our public forest lands as carbon reserves, right? And there's another school of thought which is it's not totally diametrically opposed to that, but it's that we need a mix of approaches. I mean, as I understand Matt's proposal, he is talking about having some portion. He didn't talk at all about what percentage, where that needle gets set, but have some areas set aside as reserves and have some areas where we have more of, kind of an active management approach, for different reasons. I don't know. I mean, my guess is if we called that question, there's probably a significant number of people that would object to either of those concepts for different reasons, right? So then the question is, what do we do about that? And you're making one good suggestion. Can we resolve that really fundamental divide in a work group where the people that hold those very strongly, differing views? I don't know, honestly. I don't know, because they are so diametrically opposed, and I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm just not sure whether a work group can resolve that issue or not.
Yeah, I want to add, Tom, also that when we were thinking about work groups, we're thinking of like a smaller group of people participating and really going into the details of the issue, I feel like this big issue is what most of the people here are interested in. So if we're going to create a work group, it's just essentially yet another meeting of everybody else here in a scheduling issue. I feel, I don't know if I'm wrong, but I just feel like everybody here would be interested in being part of that site work group. So are we fixing the problem?
Can I quickly comment? I support Joe's idea 100%. I think the purpose of it would be to get down from the 30,000 foot level we're at now. When we talk about these things, let's get down to the 10-foot level. Let's define exactly what actions we want to do and see how many of them can be done under the different proposals that we're talking about. Let's narrow the differences down. I suspect it's a very small set of differences, and then we could use those to actually work towards consensus. Without it, we are never going to get to consensus.
I agree with what you just said, Ken. I just worry about everybody wanting to participate of this work group and then finding the time to create separate meetings. Maybe this is something, and my co-chairs, please, have an opinion on this, but maybe this is something that we just continue having the conversation about in this actual climate work group without having to taking it into another side work group.
And I think we look for consensus, like we, Tom, I think you may have been getting to this question, but I think it'd be an appropriate question to ask, could people live with Matt Olson's idea of a diverse approach to the management of state lands, including passive management on a portion of it, including, or actually Matt just had kind of two buckets, kind of the passive and active. It'd be interesting to see if how many people can live with that idea and how many people are absolutely pro forestation, passive management on 100%, creating one big reserve. Is that a deal breaker for half this group, or is that a deal breaker for 5 people? What is it,
And the other thing I would add, Andy, is there some parameters whereby, right, because it's one thing to say it's going to be a mix. It's another thing to say it's going to be a mix that's going to be, 75% this and 25% that, or 90% this and 10% that, right? Like, so sort of the details of that, I feel like probably.
But I'm not sure you can get that deep. You can ask a simple question with no strings attached and say, are we okay with a diverse approach? Is it 75-25? Is it 25-75? Those are details that we're not going to solve in this meeting. Not a chance in this meeting, in this group. Are we going to get to a percentage breakdown? But I think we can get to a conceptual, and I think it's 30,000 feet, and that's where a lot of these conversations are taking place, is can we live with a diverse approach to management, or can we not?
That's a good place to start, Andy. I agree.
See where everybody's at.
Yeah.
I agree.
Just to and then go from there. I like that approach, Andy.
But again, I think it's helpful to say, we're not attaching string, like because you say yes to, I think a diverse approach is okay, you're not saying that we're going to log the state of New Jersey. That's not what you're saying. You're just saying I'm okay with utilizing these different tools, these different techniques in different places at different times, et cetera, similar to what Matt has presented.
We can call that question. I just,
30,000 foot level, right, Andy?
I think Joe and I know what the answer is going to be, but
I guess I'm saying, like, if you can't get to that point, then what are we talking about?
But here's the thing. Here's where I think, and maybe this is where the work group idea comes in mind, or why I think we need more discussion, because, and my guess is the only way we could possibly get to that place is with a lot more discussion of the details and the parameters, right? Because anything that sort of vague, just on what we've heard from so many people in this group in terms of their views about, really thinking there should be no active management and everything should be 100%, set aside as reserves. we already know that's a strong contingent here. We've heard that. And so those, my guess is that, that contingent is going to reject that idea. We can do it right now if you want, but I'm just saying that I think we already kind of know that. And the only way we're going to possibly get beyond that is with much more discussion of, to what degree and where, under what circumstances, and with what regulations in place, and all of that. It's sort of like all that stuff matters. And I'm just, my strong gut is that the only way to get to that place is with all these other sort of pieces that would, be necessary to give people some comfort, with a sort of a mix of strategies approach.
Yeah,
I can be
you know
totally
what,
wrong.
I'm going to disagree a little bit, because I think almost like a flow chart approach, that you start very broad, where you agree, where can people agree, and then you narrow it down like a filter. That's where the details come in. I do think that I think there's agreement here. I really enjoyed today's discussion, but I do think that we hear from a very small percentage of the participants at these meetings, and they're very vocal, and is their right. I don't know where the group stands on that very basic question that Andy
well, let's
posed.
ask
And I
it.
think it would be interesting to know what that is.
So everybody needs to put their hands down.
Yeah.
Yeah, Andy, do you mind stating the question one more time so people understand what is it that we're asking?
Yeah, so, and I know it's hard, there's not always a level of trust here, but when I ask the question, are we okay with Matt's idea here of a kind of a diverse approach to managing our forests? Can I talk without people waving? I'm going to finish the question. Can we get on board with that without all the details of the percentage that's going to be in a reserve, the percentage that's going to be under conservation? Just the idea of, we need different tools in the tool belt. I'm okay admitting or saying that we need different techniques in different places. So even for somebody who is for pro-forestation, I'm saying at times we need to include the management of our invasives, of deer, et cetera. That to me is a diverse approach. It's not just walking away and looking at it. So that's what I'm saying is a diverse approach, as Matt has described, passive and active, as simple as that. Nothing, no more details. That's it.
Okay, so Andy, the question is, I mean, you just stated the question, sorry. So
Who
we're
would
asking
disagree?
people
Yeah.
to raise their hands if they disagree to what you just explained.
Correct.
Okay.
And we can ask folks who raise their hand, what is it about that they can't get on board with?
Julie, are you trying to raise your hand? I saw you raise your real hand.
Yeah, and keep them raised, because we
Yeah.
want, we want to be able to characterize the responses. So just sit tight and keep them raised. Allie, are you we are not voting, we're not tabulating, we're
No.
characterizing, because this conversation needs to continue.
Yeah. And I think,
Yeah,
Angela,
this is-
you okay if we ask a few folks some questions
Well, let's
as we
start.
normally do?
Yeah, like why?
What, like what
Document
is it exactly?
So Nick,
It's gonna have to be quick, guys. We only have
Yeah.
like 5 or 10 minutes, so make it a quick comment or question, please. Go.
So Nick, you go ahead. You're the first.
Nick,
Nick, you're not on mute, so I believe. Oh, now you're on mute. Nick, please, there you go. You're not on mute right now. Try to speak.
okay, Sylvia,
Yes.
just skip, go to the next one.
Okay, well, first of all, I've been trying to answer my question and there's been like 10-minute delay, but there's a lot of unknowns in the proposal that Matt addressed. So I would have to say the definition of active and passive management is something that concerns most of us, in the sense that active management has been always, from our experience, has been logging and tree removal. So if there were to be any consensus, I think the consensus would be is doing active management without tree removal. And let's not forget that we are the climate group, and the climate science is clear that intact forests are our best defense. So I have a little bit of an issue with proposals that claim that creating habitat when we're in the climate group, when the science tells us otherwise. And then also I wanted to say, it's been over 100 acres logged on Sparta Mountain. Our group, New Jersey Forest Watch, has been monitoring and taking tally of all of the acreage. And in our opinion, in a high conservation value forest with over 130 rare, threatened, endangered species, it's 100 acres that should never have been cut in the first place in the Highlands region. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Leslie, you're on mute, but you can unmute yourself. Go ahead.
The question I wanted to ask Matt earlier, but it got raised by all these other people, is who would make these decisions about which forests get logged, which forests get saved, and how long would this take? And when you guys bring up, we've got proposals tomorrow from Vin, Michael Van Cleef, that also involve the same questions. And my core problem is, this is a climate crisis. I don't think we can answer these questions in the course of this task force. You were not charged with that. I think if we're going to dilly around and not make a decision that is favorable towards climate mitigation, that we should put a moratorium on logging until we make those distinctions in terms of what is to preserved, what is to not be preserved. But while we are not logging public lands, I don't think we should open them up at all until these issues are resolved. And that I can live with. And I want to say, I thought that you mischaracterized, Andy, what we said. Proforestation includes ecological management, and to act like it doesn't include invasives removals is inappropriate and untrue. And so I don't want to divide it into an approach that includes nothing and an approach that includes, a nice selection of things we'll think about later. Proforestation in my book is about restoration as well.
I apologize for jumping in here, but I'm just going to quickly say I oppose Matt's proposal because it's basically just a little bit better organized status quo.
Ken,
All the
I'm
problems
sorry
we have
to
with the status
interrupt,
quo
but
are still
Ken,
there with it.
Ken,
with
there's
his
people
proposal.
that are doing their turn. Please, everybody will have their opportunity to express their opinion. Please, let's respect each other's turn. Charles, you're next. And Nicholas, I haven't forgotten about you. I will ask you after Charles.
Yeah, I'm just agreeing, again, I'm opposing because there is just some unclarity on just what's exactly is going to be the definition between those two classifications. So, like others have said, some is like with the way people are looking at the rules and regulations, how they're done at different forest stewardship plans, things like that. Just looking at that, I think it just needs a further clarification.
Thank you, Charles. Nick, you want to try it again? You're not on mute, so let's see if we can hear you. We do not hear you. You might be having a problem with your speakers or microphone. Okay, so just to be speedy here, Joe, you're next.
The reason why I object to the proposal is because there's, like I said previously, there is still very poor data coming out of DEP on what projects are being done to what extent. There's no follow-up that's publicly available on what DEP finds within the 3 years that they shall visit these sites. There's no trust because there are horror stories out there that are really confirmed stories about certain forest stewardship projects that go wrong, but we needed an accounting of those to know why they're happening and how they can be stopped. Until all of these lack of information, lack of follow-up, lack of oversight, and lack of enforcement by the DEP, I don't think anybody is going to be willing to sign off on any proposals that sound like a way to backdoor some additional silviculture occurring on state lands. Now, but we could. I'll bet that a lot of people on this call who've expressed opposition to Matt's idea or thinking opposition. I'll bet if there were a regime that they could trust, that there was real enforcement, a level of public input, and real follow-up and disclosure by DEPs of what rules they're following, chapter and verse, and about what their findings are and about what the enforcement penalties are. I'll bet if there were trust in the system, then I'll bet that's a lot more people would come across the line and say, okay, I would be willing to tolerate or to embrace more silviculture on certain portions of state lands. But right now, there's just not enough trust. So that's why, and that's DEP's fault and the taxpayers' fault for not funding it. So that's why I would say no to that proposal.
Thank you, Joe. Ken, you are next. You're on mute, Ken.
I apologize for jumping in. It was getting close to 6 o'clock and I was afraid you were going to shut down. I support what Joe was saying. I think that's the only way we're going to get to, if we're going to get to consensus, that's the only way to do it.
What Joe just said? Is that what you just said? Sorry.
Yes, that we have to get to the level of detail and talk about exactly what kinds of actions we are both talking about and see what can and cannot be done under different regimes and see how far away we are, how far apart we really are. We're never going to get there by taking this 30,000 foot approach.
Got it.
So Anjali,
yes.
let's ask another question. It's 6:05, we're already after time, but everybody seems to be hanging in there. So let's ask the inverse, or kind of the inverse, I guess you would say. So who could live with, or who couldn't live with a pro-forestation approach to 100% of state lands?
Wait, let's lower the first hands first so that
Yeah, lower hands,
yeah,
sorry.
No, that's a great way of like turning it around. Please repeat that question, Andy, for clarity's sake.
So who would be opposed to applying the kind of pro-forestation approach or passive management to 100% of New Jersey's lands?
Emil.
Ken, we can hear you.
Ken, we can hear you, buddy. You're not muted. Emil, what are you doing? Emil, I'm just gonna pick you out. You didn't raise your hand first, but why don't you speak, if you would? I'd love to hear what you have to say. Why you couldn't live with pro-forestation on 100% of the state lands.
Maybe it's because I'm not sure what you mean by pro-forestation, but there's no way that we can't put fire breaks around communities in the Pine Barrens. There's no way that we can't do things on all those forests that are already emitters because they're nothing but dead ash trees out in Somerset County or Hunterdon County or wherever it might be. I mean, and I don't know if dealing with those kinds of issues, if that falls into that's still allowable to deal with all those things under pro-forestation. I mean, it might turn out that we have to dig up a dead ash forest and to get rid of all the invasives and herbicide it and plant it with natives and put a deer fence around it. And if that's pro-forestation, I don't think that is. So I can't live with hands off except for, no removal of product and removal of invasives. And, I mean, I'm a pretty hands off kind of guy, but in the Pine Barrens and in some of these really horrible places, I don't think we can have 100% things that would qualify as pro-forestation. On the other hand, that's why I didn't put my hand up until late, because I'm almost in that camp, right?
Thanks, Emil. Thanks for the clarification. That was good. All right, Anjali, back to you. Sorry, if you want to start at the top. We'll stay, I guess, if people are good staying for a few more minutes.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's 10 after almost.
Matt.
Yeah, you know what? It's pretty much my proposal says it. So I think I'd prefer to give the floor to somebody who hasn't talked yet that maybe would share a
Thank you.
different.
Thank you, Matt. We appreciate that. Larry, you're next.
Okay, I think the reason I would be opposed to 100% pro-forestation is because of the objectives and goals for public land that Matt talked about, that sometimes we're going to need management for early successional endangered species, for recreational purposes, or for other issues.
Thank you, Larry. Erica.
Hey, everyone. Yes, no, just going back to basically what Matt and what I'm sure Vin will also go over tomorrow too. It's just entirely too nuanced to promote proforestation just when we can see what has happened from the past and what we're dealing with now with invasives and everything else that need to be addressed. And it's not working, so something else has to happen.
Thank you, Erica. Geoffrey, you can speak.
I would agree with pretty much what a lot of the other people have said. To kind of put one blanket over the whole state would make it very difficult. In South Jersey, you know, life and property have to be taken into account, and by allowing no management, I think we increase the wildfire risk greatly, and it's already classified as a, you know, very high or extreme within the Pine Barrens, and with doing nothing, it's just going to get worse.
Okay, thank you. Nancy?
Okay. Yeah, I agree with much of the other comments. I feel that, you know, much of our forests, I'm in Northwest New Jersey, and I see particularly on municipal lands and local forest, local state-owned lands, the need for trail maintenance and safety and water quality protection and protecting invasive species and property line maintenance. You can't have a no hands-off approach. And probably for the first time in a long time, I agree with Emil. I really feel that we are not working with the same definitions. I don't know what proforestation means, and I haven't seen a really, really good definition at all. That's my perspective.
Thank you, Nancy. I kind of my commentary a little bit. I agree with the definition issue. I feel like everybody has their own unique definition, and I think maybe it would be worth it for this task force to come up with some working definitions. I don't know if this would take forever, but I think it would be helpful because, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think like the forest stewardship and forest management and woodlots, and we're not using the same terminology in the same way. And as a scientist, I object.
Me too. Ben, you're next.
Yeah, so I mean, you'll be hearing from me tomorrow, I guess, quite a bit about these same subjects. It's kind of tailored with, kind of dovetails with what Matt has to say. I would say, you know, in my experience, a one size fits all never is a great approach. It's led to a lot of detrimental conservation in the past. And I also, I don't know how to like, I think like there's nuance to these things like proforestation and logging management and stewardship, like that we're not on the same page. As from my perspective, stewardship's been around not very long. And so I'm kind of confused as to what that means. Same with proforestation. When I dig into the science on that, to me, it kind of looks like agenda-driven science. Like there's a lot of background papers that it references that take things out of context and there's biases. So under the context of like the MUMA paper, et cetera, I take issue with that. And so I'd like to see a little bit more of a deep dive on that before I can sign off on anything in terms of that. But usually, kind of like Emil's saying, a balanced approach is probably the best strategy. That's my 2 cents.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Ben. Oh, I lost track. Don, you're next.
Well, I generally think that, we need to keep all the tools in the toolbox, but more importantly, perhaps after close to 30 years of being somebody who's actively managed forests, these are natural systems and they don't always respond to the way we think things are going to happen, whether that's passive or active management. And I think it's foolish to lock ourselves into any one paradigm on how we're going to, consider any kind of land, even if it is a pro-forestation approach or an active management approach. We have to be adaptive. And if this whole experience with climate change and our climate situation isn't an example of why we have to be adaptive, we've really lost kind of scope on what we're doing. We have to be able to respond to changes in the system in the next couple of years that we don't know are going to happen as the climate changes. So we have to remain adaptive, and we shouldn't be, even if we all agreed that we should take certain pathways on certain lands now, we have to remain flexible that could change in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Thanks, Don. Jen, you're next.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. So ditto to what Emil said. And then building on what Don just said about needing to maintain our flexibility of approach, I think is really important. If we are taking the perspective, and I've heard a lot of people do it in this meeting and previous meetings, of taking the climate crisis into consideration, I think that's the right and responsible thing to do. There are a few things we need to realize. One, carbon is not going to get us out of the climate crisis, period. We absolutely positively need to address methane. And that is the big thing that nobody's paying attention to, except for maybe California's governor at this point in time. And so, yes, we should pay attention to carbon, but it's not the only thing that's going to get us out of the climate crisis. And carbon sequestration through New Jersey forests is certainly not going to do it. We just don't have enough. We just do not have that kind of land that has forest in New Jersey. Will it help and bite around the edges? Sure, but it's not going to get there. We're going to transition out of a fossil fuel economy and fight the climate crisis by changing transportation, by changing building efficiency, by changing our energy resources. So we have to keep that into context as well, that we're talking about minimal improvements here. The thing we have not talked about in this meeting with regard to the climate crisis is the fact that given moderate emissions scenarios, so that slight reduction over greenhouse gas emissions from today, within my natural lifetime, within my expected lifetime, New Jersey is going to have a climate that is more similar to North Carolina today. So what we're going to see is species who do not have time to evolve are exerting northward pressure for cooler climates. How are we going to, some of those species are not going to make it. We're going to see a lot of extinction over the next 30, 40 years. But how are we going to receive northward pressures of threatened and endangered species and really honestly species of concern? So I think we've got to take into account the experts on habitat, on just keeping available resources for people who are at the cutting edge for this. And so that kind of embraces my concerns about saying absolutely no, we're never going to touch a tree in New Jersey. So, and I don't know if Emil was trying to get in something there, or I said something that irritated him, or maybe he just wasn't on mute. So, happy to continue to talk, but those are some of my concerns here. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen. Stephen, you're next.
Yes. I wanted to, the reason why I would disagree with pro-forestation, I'm almost entirely in favor of it, but the basic issue that's killing our forest, I think, is the overgrowth of deer. And I think to just say that, to go with a blanket pro-forestation approach would not take into account that overgrowth. And I think we have to address that so that new forest growth can actually take place. Which won't happen with the tremendous overgrowth of deer in New Jersey. And now I know there are remedies, or at least some proposals that are being investigated with it. So I'm just saying that I wouldn't go for an unconditional pro-forestation, nor would I go for an unconditional silviculture. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Browen, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I apologize. You can unmute yourself. Yeah. You're not on mute, but we don't hear you. Yeah. Sorry. Amy, you just left. I was gonna. Amy Green, hi. We will try Browen again. But Amy, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate everybody having this forum. I think instead of a black and white approach, I kind of like that idea of people weighing in on the issues. We could develop a survey with what people are in favor of and not. Leslie Sauer, I think, is correct. Pro-forestation is not, don't do anything at all. But instead of it being one thing or the other, we can define things that people feel are appropriate or scientifically based or not. I think that it's absolutely essential to not do timber harvesting in our forest and to promote their regeneration and their continued survival, both for carbon, for habitat, for water quality, for water supply. I don't see timber harvesting as being a solution to those things. While I respect a lot of the foresters in the state, when I hear their justifications for things like Sparta Mountain, they don't jive with the science. There's no reason to create early successional habitat out of mature forests. We have opportunities on power line rights of way or existing fields, that sort of thing. So maybe if you could, like, and of course, deer management, I think, is essential. Invasive species control is essential. Allowing things like putting up deer exclosures or fire breaks, or, you know, things that everybody's gonna probably agree are appropriate. So maybe to make a list of actions that are acceptable or unacceptable instead of just yes or no, black and white, might be an approach to at least seeing how the group feels.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I'm just gonna give you one last try, Browen. Yeah, we don't hear you. So sorry. Okay, we are 6:20 and we have a lot of folks left, and we said we mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that we were going to discuss the voting. Can everybody hear me, by the way? I'm just getting weird faces. Okay. Yeah, so the voting, so far, you know, our discussions have landed that, you know, we're going to have the New Jersey residents. Of course, New Jersey residents' opinions and vote will count. Eileen, Tom, Andy, if I'm saying something correct, please feel free to chime in. We're going to have votes count for businesses as an individual New Jersey resident. And we're going to look at different organizations dependent on size. And what we've landed so far is small, medium, and large, because this task force has many different types of organizations, ones that are relatively small compared to others that are really, really big with thousands and thousands and thousands of members. And then we're also going to consider governmental agencies. We've also landed on 3 different levels. That's going to be local, which would mean like municipal level, for example. Then you would have like the county, or like kind of like the regional, like
You speaking?
something.
Hello?
Sorry, guys, don't interrupt. I'm trying to follow my train of thought. So, so like county or like a region within New Jersey, and then we're going to have statewide governmental agencies. I believe DEP will not be voting. So that is a good caveat. And in terms of the weight of what we're going to allocate for like the small, medium, large organizations, we have not landed on that as of yet, but stay tuned. We will share with you that later on. But that's how we're going to be categorizing the voting. But I want to re-emphasize that what we strive for is consensus, because I don't really think that the legislature has any interest in going for things that get a 60 to 40 vote. I don't think they're going to be that controversial and go to something that's going to cause a lot of chaos. They're going to strive to go for the things that we reach consensus, where the big majority of us are saying, yeah, we actually support this idea. So just re-emphasizing that. Tom, Eileen, Andy, did I miss anything?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize the fact, because I've heard people say that individuals have no voice. You do, that you absolutely do. Organizations will be weighted, and because they represent many people. But if you're an individual homeowner, you will have a vote. So I just wanted to make sure people knew that.
Thanks, Eileen. Tom?
The only thing I'd add, just sort of thinking about the process from here, is that I think so far we've determined, we've had a number of proposals, really good discussion around those proposals. It's pretty clear at the moment we don't have consensus on the proposals that were heard today, I think one way or the other. But we're not, we don't just want to leap to voting. I think what we want to do is continue the conversation to try to find consensus for the reasons that Anjali noted, because that was really our charge from the senator. We know that consensus is going to be much more powerful, in terms of a legislature, if it's a consensus item versus a voting item. So I would propose that we started a really good discussion today. We're obviously not there yet. We don't have consensus. We don't want to just say, well, we don't have consensus, so let's give up and move on. We don't want to just jump right to voting either. I think we all owe it to each other and ourselves to continue this conversation to see if and where we can find consensus. So I think Eileen and I plan to continue this conversation tomorrow, because the proposals are of a similar nature. They're not really nested in kind of climate and reforestation, but they are the proposals that, get at, this sort of core issue of, whether there's sort of a mix of strategies and how we plan for that, and kind of the role of science and all those things. So I would just propose we continue that conversation tomorrow, continue this conversation tomorrow through the proposals that we have teed up there. Then let the four co-chairs digest kind of where we are at that point. We'll definitely consider Joe's very good proposal as to whether a work group would be, a subgroup would be helpful to continue this conversation. But these are really these are among the biggest issues that this task force needs to figure out. I don't think anyone should expect that we've got them figured out in our first really kind of 2.5 hour conversation about the hardest issues. So let's allow ourselves more time, for this conversation to continue. And if at the end of the day, we may need to put this to a vote, right? But I think we all want to first, make the effort and put the time in to see if we can find consensus on these issues first.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Eileen and Andy. Leslie, is this a question about this? Go ahead, Leslie.
I would just like to say that I think the vote was kind of misstated, because I know not one single person who thinks that passive management, do nothing, proforestation is what we should be doing in New Jersey. All of the people who spoke this morning talked about the need for management of things like deer. So to use that language, I think is very problematic. 2/3 of the people supported it anyway. And I think if you included deer management, the kinds of things Emil and Amy were talking about, you would get a much higher degree of support for proforestation. It's the commercial extraction of wood that we are objecting to, the use of heavy equipment to do that.
This
And I
is
think
noted.
that's-
Thank you, Leslie. All right, everybody. So it's 6:30. Like Tom just said, we're going to continue this conversation tomorrow, because the proposals tomorrow are very similar in the same issues. So thank you for staying on till this late. We appreciate your time and your dedication. So we will see you tomorrow at 4. you all have the links and you all have the proposals that we will be discussing. So I appreciate you.
Thanks, everybody.